2025 gave us a lot of movies that tried to explain the current state of politics. But one battle after another was particularly interesting because it shows us how this political landscape is filled with paranoia, panic, and instability. And as I rewatched the movie, I noticed that this film isn't really a movie about revolution. It's a movie about failed parents and children who now have to live with that. And I don't just mean parents in the literal biological sense. I mean parents as the people, the systems, and the ideologies that raise you, the forces that tell you what's right, what's safe, who to trust, what kind of person you're supposed to become. Because that's the tension at the heart of this film. Willa grows up surrounded by adults who all claim they know how the world works, and yet none of them actually hold the world together. Not emotionally, not politically, not morally. Well, maybe one of them does, but more to that later. So Willa, played by the wonderful rising star Chase Infinity, has to do what a lot of Gen Z feels forced to do right now. Grow up too fast, carry responsibility too early, and build a moral compass out of fragments. I keep coming back to this phrase. Choose your parent, America. Because the film isn't only asking Willa to make that choice, it's asking the country, the United States. America has two parents living inside it at the same time. On the surface, it's built on freedom, rights, democracy, the self-image of a nation that pushed history forward. But underneath that, deeply ingrained in its DNA, it's also built on blood, genocide, racial violence, and exploitation. Both of these things are true at the same time. Both are inherited. Both are part of the United States DNA. And the question is, which one do you claim as your lineage? Which values do you continue and which values do you consciously reject? And director Paul Thomas Anderson makes that question almost brutally literal because this movie eventually turns into a story about actual bloodline, about DNA, about a father who tries to verify his child's DNA because someone who shares his blood could not possibly have values that are so strongly unlike his own. But before we get to the DNA test, I want to start where the film really begins emotionally, with Willa as a portray of a generation that doesn't feel protected by its elders anymore, a generation living in permanent crisis mode, asking the simplest and most terrifying question of all: who do I trust? Willa isn't just a character in this movie, she's a mirror, a portrait of a generation. She represents the Gen Z. Willa's whole story feels like a coming-of-age story, and in that way it represents the coming-of-age story of the Gen Z. Willa feels like Gen Z not because she's a relatable teen character, but because her entire nervous system is calibrated to emergency. Throughout the film, she's constantly scanning her environment for danger, constantly trying to survive in an unstable and chaotic world, constantly ready for something to go wrong. And the film treats that as normal, not exceptional. It's the baseline. And if you're alive right now and paying attention, that baseline probably sounds familiar. The film often feels like an overblown political action thriller, loud, paranoid, on edge. But that's also what life can feel like right now if you're paying attention. Because Gen Z grew up in a permanent state of instability, climate crisis on the horizon like a timer that you can't turn off, pandemic aftermath, economic uncertainty, social media pressure, the sense that the world is accelerating faster than anyone can emotionally process, and on top of that, this ongoing feeling of political regression, fascism on the rise openly, in real time, not just in America but across Europe too, war after war, crisis after crisis, with AI escalating faster than ethical frameworks can keep up. It's like reality in the 21st century has the pacing of an action thriller. And the thing is, when you grow up inside a permanent state of emergency, your nervous system adapts to crisis as the baseline. You become hyper alert, you scan for danger, you expect collapse. You live with the feeling that something is always about to happen because something is always happening. And one battle feels like that too. It's hectic, paranoid, high speed, constantly on the move, like you don't even get time to exhale. But what's so interesting is that the movie isn't just using that energy for entertainment, it's using it as psychological realism. It's showing what it feels like to grow up in a world where stability is no longer assumed, where the sentiment of the adults will handle it is no longer a believable sentence. So when I call this a coming of age story, I don't mean it in a cute, nostalgic way. I mean it as forced maturity, being pushed into adulthood before you're ready, being asked to carry responsibility you didn't choose, being told implicitly or explicitly that you have to fix what you inherited. That's Willa. She's a kid who gets thrown into cold water and is expected to swim. Bob and Sensei, the two adult figures who genuinely care about her, try to prepare her as best as they can, but the world she's being prepared for is already burning. The older generations failed, and now the burden slides down the timeline. Willa is introduced as someone who still is a kid. She goes to the school dance, she desires the prom night version of life. Friends, music, dancing, a carefree, normal night. And then the world hijacks her. The state hijacks her. History hijacks her. The crisis interrupts the party. The emergency breaks into the coming-of-age moment and says, "No, you don't get to just be a kid." And the film underlines that with one of its simplest visual choices. Willa pretty much wears her prom dress over the course of the whole movie. She's fighting and running and surviving while dressed for a teenage memory. It's like PTA is refusing to let you forget what's being stolen from her. Willa's forced maturity doesn't just exist in the vibe of the film, it's built into her relationship with Bob. Because in a normal coming-of-age story, the parent is the stabilizer. The parent is the one who regulates the child. The parent is the one who absorbs fear and turns it into safety. In one battle, it often feels flipped. Willa is the one regulating the adult. There's a scene early on that basically displays this whole dynamic perfectly. Willa finds out Bob drove home drunk the night before and she snaps. Not like a rebellious teen, but like a stressed out caretaker. She tells him in essence, "I don't want to be your babysitter. I don't want to have to worry about you. I didn't ask for this. This is just how the cards were rolled for me." That line hits hard because it captures something beyond their relationship. The feeling of being born into circumstances you didn't choose. Not just family chaos, but historical chaos. Like your entire generation got handed a mess and told to make something out of it. And Bob's response to her is so small, but also so revealing. Instead of hearing and understanding her, instead of taking in the emotional truth of what she's saying, he corrects her, pedantically. "It's dice, honey. The saying goes that's how the dice were rolled." It's almost funny, but it's also devastating because it's a perfect display of how the older generation often fails the younger one. Not necessarily through cruelty, but through this reflex to teach instead of simply listening. To respond with, "Well, actually," to the devastating pain, to still have the desire to be technically right even while being historically wrong. And this is where a term frequently used in psychology fits so perfectly. Parentification. Parentification is when a child takes on a parental role inside an unstable household. The parent can't self-regulate, can't provide consistent co-regulation. So the child becomes the emotional stabilizer. The child becomes the one who anticipates danger, manages conflict, keeps the adult from spiraling. The child grows up early not because they are mature, but because they have to be. That's Willa. She often feels like the rational person in the room. She's more composed than Bob. She reads situations faster. She makes decisions. She keeps him from collapsing. And if you zoom out, that dynamic becomes political. Gen Z feels like it's parenting a burned out older generation. Adults who are overwhelmed, ideologically fragmented, emotionally exhausted, but still acting like they know better, still treating the younger generation as naive, even while handing them the consequences of decades of their failure. And the film keeps reminding you visually that this is wrong. As I said, Willa is still wearing that prom dress. She's still a kid, but she's being forced into the adult role, forced into responsibility, survival, vigilance. While the grown man she's stuck with is vaping, panicking, running around in a bathrobe, talking in revolutionary slogans, and forgetting the password to his own movement. I love the phrase fellow YouTuber Lucas Blue used in his video for this, inheritance of consequence, because that's the specific kind of inheritance this film highlights. Not money, not legacy, not tradition, but consequences. And Chase Infinity's performance sells this completely. She carries herself like someone who has had to be responsible for too long. There's maturity in her face, in her presence, in how she reacts to Bob's chaos. Their dynamic doesn't feel like a child being guided by a parent. It often feels like a child trying to keep a parent from falling apart. Willa grows up inside a house of failed ideologies, and I mean that almost literally. Her family isn't just her biological family, it's an entire political lineage, a chain of adults who claim to know how the world works, claim to know what must be done, and still left behind a reality that feels unstable, paranoid, and unfinished. The film isn't just asking, what do you inherit from your parents? It's asking, what do you inherit from a country, from a century, from movements that once promised liberation and now feels like ruins you still have to live in. Willa doesn't just have one parent, she has multiple parental figures, and each one represents a different model of authority, care, and ideology. In other words, she isn't just choosing between people, she's choosing between entire political archetypes. And what makes the film so unsettling is that none of these models fully work. First, there's Lockjaw, her biological father. Discipline, order, hierarchy, strength, control. The toxic masculine authority figure who believes belonging is obedience and identity is bloodline. He's meticulous, organized, cold, a father whose love is conditional, whose care is fused with ownership. He doesn't protect, he possesses. Then of course there's Bob, the father who actually raises her. Bob represents idealism, anti-establishment energy, the romantic myth of resistance. He means well, he genuinely loves Willa. He's trying to be respectful, trying to be the good and woke dad, trying to keep up with the values of the new generation. But he's also chaotic, paranoid, burned out, and often ineffective. He's the kind of parent who wants to teach freedom but can't provide stability. He's love without structure, a warm mess. Then there's Perfidia, Willa's biological mother. She represents uncompromising revolt. Big ideology, big drama, performance, total commitment, revolution as identity. But she also represents something the film treats as one of the most traumatic parental acts imaginable: abandonment.
I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my child!
She disappears. She becomes the tragic traitor of the story, the parent who leaves the child with nothing but fragments and aftershocks and without guidance. And finally there's Sensei, not her biological parent, but arguably the most functional parental figure in the film, even though we only see them together maybe once on screen throughout the movie. Sensei is her karate teacher. He represents discipline without domination, structure without cruelty, political practice that's grounded in care and community. He isn't loud, he doesn't mythologize himself, he doesn't turn politics into theater. He just does the work. He models a kind of adulthood that actually holds. Willa doesn't receive one clear ideology handed down like a legacy. She receives shards, mistrust, instability, paranoia, and competing narratives that all claim to be truth. And if you want to read this through the lens of intergenerational trauma, it fits. The child doesn't inherit only ideals. The child inherits the fractures the adults never healed. This is also where the Star Wars comparison starts to feel useful, even if it sounds silly at first. I first got to it because Leonardo DiCaprio kept mentioning in interviews how the story feels like Star Wars in many ways. And the more I sat with the film, the more that comparison clicked for me. One battle really does have its own ecosystem. Myths, lore, secret organizations, resistance networks, coded communication, bounty hunters, shadow alliances, chosen ones, a sense of history that existed before the movie starts and keeps going after it ends. And it has that specific Star Wars tension at its center. The child discovering who the father really is. Star Wars story, stripped down at its core, is pretty simple. A son realizes his father is the villain. And then the question becomes, do I join him or do I fight him? Do I repeat him or do I become my own line through mentors and chosen family instead of blood? It's not just about good versus evil, it's about inheritance versus choice. Willa's story has that same architecture. Lockjaw is the Darth Vader figure, the authoritarian villain that is revealed to be the father, the bloodline threat. Sensei represents the Obi-Wan, Yoda role, the mentor who teaches a kind of strength that isn't rooted in domination. Meanwhile, Bob is the idealistic father figure, but he's also a fuck-up, loving, sincere, but unreliable, not a hero, not the savior. And Perfidia is the tragic traitor archetype, the parent who should have stayed but didn't. Funnily enough, Lockjaw even comes back from the dead in the end of the movie, which feels Darth Vader coded the more you think about it. I'm not sure if all of this is intentional. I don't think so. I would love to hear PTA speak on this, but it's still an interesting reading of the film, I believe. But unlike Star Wars, PTA refuses the catharsis. There is no clean empire collapse. There is no final evil is defeated relief. The system remains. The struggle continues. The child still has to build a life inside the mess. It's one battle after another, which is why the question choose your parent isn't just a metaphor here. It's the psychological task of the movie. Willa has to decide which model of adulthood she will carry forward, which values she will inherit, which stories she will refuse to repeat. The film's parenthood theme expands beyond Willa's personal story and turns into something broader, almost national. Because once you start seeing parents as ideologies, the movie begins to read like an allegory for America itself. America is a child of contradictory parents. On one side, it's built on ideas like freedom, rights, democracy, ideals that undeniably pushed history forward in certain ways, at least on paper. That's the one parent, the one America loves to claim in speeches, in textbooks, in monuments. But on the other side, America is also built on blood. Genocide, slavery, white supremacy, racial hierarchy, imperial violence. That's the parent that's always there in the bloodstream even when it's denied. The parent that keeps showing up in policy, in policing, in borders, in who gets protected and who gets punished. Both of these lineages are real, both are inherited, both are part of the country's DNA. I have to think about this quote from Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, where Sirius tells Harry that we've all got light and dark inside us, but what matters is the part we choose to act on, and that is what reveals who we really are. So the question isn't whether one of them is the truth. The question is which parent America chooses to identify with, which values it continues, which values it consciously rejects. Because origin alone doesn't dictate destiny, unless you decide it does. When a society becomes unstable, who do I trust stops being a conversation topic and becomes a survival mechanism. And in the US right now, that trust collapse makes a lot of sense. Republicans have become openly unhinged, not even hiding it anymore. I don't think I have to dive too deeply into the lunacy of the right. But the liberal establishment doesn't exactly feel like a clean parental figure either. There's decades of disappointment, endless compromises, political cowardice, foreign policy violence, and an inability to stop the rise of the right, even when the right is screaming what it wants to do. So if you're growing up in this world as a young adult, it's not hard to see why trust feels impossible. It's not just that the villains are scary, it's that the supposed guardians don't feel reliable either. And that's exactly Willa's emotional position throughout the film. She's not choosing between good and evil like a cartoon. She's choosing between models of adulthood that all contain betrayal and disappointment in different forms. That's why she's hyper alert. That's why she's suspicious. That's why she hesitates when someone steps out of a car and claims to be that everything's okay. Who can you trust in a world that is falling apart in front of your eyes without anyone able to save it? In a world that asks you to save it. One of the major plot points of the film is that Lockjaw captures Willa to see if she is actually his biological daughter. He doesn't ask her who she is, he doesn't listen to her, he tries to verify her. And PTA stages this moment as if it's a religious ceremony. The scene is overblown, epic, ritualistic. The score swells and drones like we're witnessing something ancient and monumental. The imagery is sacred, and the decision that makes it even more loaded is the location, a church, which immediately raises the question, why here? Why not some sterile official room, some private facility, some back office? Why a place drenched in symbolism? Because a church is where identity gets officially declared. Baptisms, weddings, funerals. These are rituals where communities say, this is who you are now. And that's exactly what Lockjaw is trying to do. He's not just testing whether Willa shares his blood. He's trying to fix an outlier, a bug in the system, an error in his fantasy of America. Willa, while she shares Lockjaw's blood, has fundamentally different worldviews and embodies values on the other side of the spectrum. Lockjaw tries to control his bloodline, his ideology, his America. Lockjaw doesn't treat fatherhood as care, he treats it as authority and ownership. And the church also functions as an emblem of old power structures, tradition, hierarchy, obedience, the weight of the past. That connects directly to what we've already seen earlier with the Sisterhood of the Brave Beaver, a monastery-coded offshoot of the French 75. Dogmatic, rule-based, out of time, almost like a sect, a cult. Different politics, similar structure. Both replace uncertainty with ritual. Both feel like adults turning ideology into religion because ambiguity is unbearable. But the most important part of the DNA test scene isn't Lockjaw's grand authoritarian theater. It's Willa's refusal to play along. Even tied up, she's defiant, mouthy, unimpressed. She doesn't treat Lockjaw like a god. She doesn't surrender to the destiny energy he's trying to conjure. And that resistance flips the power dynamics in a subtle way. Lockjaw becomes insecure, defensive, almost off balance. He doesn't feel in control, even though he's the one holding Willa hostage. It's like the film is saying, the next generation is sick of the old generation's rituals and doesn't take this shit any longer. And it's consistent too. Willa shows the same attitude with the leftist Beaver's leader. She isn't intimidated by dogma, by tradition, by stern authority. She pushes back. She stands her ground. There's not a single moment where Willa doesn't fight or stand her ground. She is focused and determined until the end. Which is why the DNA test becomes such a brutal symbol. In this scene, she is reduced to origin, blood, biology, proof. Her identity is being forced into the oldest imaginable logic. You are what you come from. And then the test confirms it. Willa really is Lockjaw's daughter, and PTA stages that reveal with full opera-esque weight. It's basically an I am your father moment, mythic, grand, Star Wars level dramatic. The film is deliberately dialing the symbolism to maximum volume because it wants you to feel what's at stake psychologically. A child being told that her destiny is already written. But the entire arc of the film is built to contradict that message. Because by the end, Willa's evolution is a refusal to let DNA define her values. The fact that Lockjaw is her father changes nothing about what she stands for. She may share his blood, but she doesn't share his worldview. And that's the film's core claim about identity, personal and political. Origin is real, but origin isn't command. Yes, your roots can explain you, but they don't have to imprison you. Yes, your country can be built on blood and genocide, but you don't have to repeat that path. That's why the DNA test being true is such a powerful narrative move. It's the film saying yes, the bloodline is real, the father reveal is real, the origin is real, but the message is still, you can become something else. You can refuse destiny without denying history. So by the end, Willa's arc is a refusal to let DNA define destiny. She may share Lockjaw's blood, she may share Perfidia's blood, but she doesn't have to inherit their path. She becomes something else, not through denial of her roots, but through transformation. She outgrows her parents, she surpasses them, she builds a self that is not simply the continuation of lineage. And this is where two thinkers become useful because they give language to what Willa is doing emotionally and politically. The anti-colonial philosopher Frantz Fanon writes about decolonization as a violent rupture with the past. Not a polite reform, not an adjustment, but a break that produces something new. A new identity doesn't emerge from simply adapting to the old structure. It emerges from transformation. That's Willa. She doesn't simply pick a side between her inherited ideologies. She processes them and becomes her own line. And with Friedrich Nietzsche, you can sharpen it into a provocative idea. Every generation has to symbolically kill their father, not in hatred, but to avoid repetition, to become autonomous, to stop living as an echo of the past. The phrase God is dead is basically a proclamation that the values inherited by the church are outdated and need to be outgrown. Willa doesn't rebel against Bob out of contempt. She evolves past him. She takes what is alive in him, the care, the honesty, the vulnerability, without inheriting the dysfunction. She refuses to become another tragic adult stuck in ideology as identity. Even Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, which was later grotesquely misused by the Nazis, adds philosophically to this. The Übermensch is a human being who creates values rather than simply inheriting moral systems. And that's what Willa does. The old systems, Bob's burned out romantic revolution, Perfidia's dramatic absolutism, the brave beaver monastery's dogma, don't actually get her out of her situation. What helps her survive is discipline, resilience, responsibility, fighting spirit, the kind of practical strength Sensei models. Ultimately, Willa saves herself. By the way, I also made another video where I explain why Sensei is the better alternative to the French 75 and how the movie is not only a critique of the right but also a self-critique of the left. Check that video out too if you're interested. So mäßig. That's why transformation is the right word, not rebellion. Rebellion would imply she's just reacting. Transformation means she's creating a new moral shape out of a broken blueprint. She takes what is useful, discipline, courage, care, the refusal to submit, and rejects the parts that are poisoned: ego, spectacle, purity, politics, domination, self-mythology. She doesn't just pick a side, she builds a posture. By the time we reach the ending, the film has basically trained Willa's nervous system and ours to treat certainty as dangerous. Nothing is certain. No one can be trusted. Everyone is compromised in some way. Every institution feels contaminated. Every parent figure comes with contradictions. The right is openly monstrous and cruel, but the supposed guardians aren't clean either. The left has its own failures, its own performative myths, its own fragmentation. So Willa's suspicion isn't teenage angst, it's survival intelligence. Which is why the final trust moment lands like the real climax. When Bob steps out of the car at the end, Willa hesitates. For a brief second, she doesn't even seem sure it's really him. On the surface, you can read it plainly. Exhaustion, trauma, a nervous system pushed way past its limits. When you've been hunted, captured, dragged through chaos, your brain starts treating even familiar faces as potential threats. But symbolically, it hits harder. Even the good father figure is no longer immediately recognizable. Nothing feels stable anymore. Everyone is suspect. Trust itself has been damaged so deeply that it requires verification. The film turns that tiny hesitation into a portrait of a generation, hyper-alert, disoriented, skeptical of authority, skeptical even of supposed safety, because the world taught them that safety is often a mask. And yet, she chooses Bob. Willa chooses Bob as her parent, not because he's perfect, not because he has answers, not because he suddenly becomes heroic. She chooses him because across all his flaws, he consistently showed up throughout her life with care and effort. He is not the revolution, he is not the savior, he is not the competent political agent, but he is the parent who stayed, who tried, who can be corrected, who can learn. And that choice is the film's most tender political statement. The next generation isn't looking for perfect leaders, they are looking for something human that doesn't gaslight them, something real, someone who doesn't demand loyalty through fear, someone who is flawed but present. At the same time, Willa choosing Bob doesn't collapse her into dependency either. It actually proves her autonomy, because she isn't choosing him as a destiny. She's choosing him as a relationship, while still becoming her own moral center. She can accept love without inheriting failure. That's why the ending feels like a passing of the torch without being corny. The older generation learns it isn't the hero. The younger generation takes the fight forward, but not by repeating the same drama, the same chaos, the same destructive patterns. By doing it differently, by staying awake, by transforming. And the film seals that with its final little punchline image. Bob lying on the couch trying to take a selfie with his new phone, while he previously was so vehemently against the usage of smartphones. It looks silly, but it's thematically precise. It's the old generation finally adapting, finally letting itself be influenced, finally learning instead of only teaching. It's Bob, the clumsy ally, the failed revolutionary, the anxious dad, accepting that his role isn't to be the messiah. His role is to raise someone who can do it better than him. Both PTA and DiCaprio commented in interviews that Bob's only real heroic achievement in the movie is that he was a loving father who cared and put in effort and raised someone competent. The passing the torch reading of the film is not presented as a triumphant superhero moment. It's closer to a confession. The older generation implicitly is saying, "We didn't manage to do enough. We didn't stop what was coming. We didn't protect you from what we knew was building. We got distracted, we got cynical, we got addicted to drama and self-mythologizing performance. We got lost inside our own ideology, and now you're standing in the ruins of that, trying to build a life in this mess. We're sorry, but it's important that you keep fighting and do better than us." This doesn't land as a motivational speech, it lands as a burden. And the question the film leaves you with is not whether Willa will fight. She will, she always does. The question is whether she can fight without becoming them. The film doesn't frame the next generation as the hope in some corny, inspirational way. It frames them as the people who are forced to become hope because there's no one else left to do it. Willa embodies that shift. She isn't simply the future as a slogan. She's the consequence of everything that came before her. She grows up inside a house full of collapsed narratives. Lockjaw's authoritarian order, Perfidia's uncompromising revolution as performance, Bob's messy idealism, the sisterhood's dogmatic retreat. None of these paths fully work. None of them fully hold. So she has to do something that feels both political and deeply personal. Transform inheritance into choice.